Hello and welcome to the Idaho Reports podcast. I'm Logan Finney. Joining me this week is Amy Dundon, who is a legislative strategist with the American Civil Liberties Union of Idaho, ACLU. Amy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Logan.
So I want to acknowledge that last week on this podcast, we sat down with Rachel Spacek with Investigate West and dove pretty deep into an immigration bill that the legislature is considering. Your organization, ACLU of Idaho, has said that you intend to sue if that becomes law.
That's true. So it is being engrossed, so it's being printed as we're talking. By the time folks hear this, it might have passed the House as amended. The bill is unconstitutional. It's definitely going to have an impact on immigrant families, children, and businesses here in Idaho. It is stylized to target criminals. It would really affect anyone who could be stopped by the police or is even accused of a crime, whether or not that accusation is founded. And for those reasons, we do intend to file a lawsuit should the governor, first, should the House pass it and as amended, and second, should the governor sign it into law.
All right, well, we'll be sure to keep an eye on that and keep listeners updated as that moves through the process. There are some other immigration-related bills that you are also keeping tabs on over ACLU. Can we walk through some of those bills and what your concerns are with them?
Absolutely. So I think the first one is it has to do with public benefits and who can access them. As it stands, there are very limited public benefits that are available to folks who are undocumented in Idaho. Specifically, the ones that are permitted right now have to do with communicable diseases or, things that children might need, including food or food assistance. This bill would force public agencies, anyone who's providing public benefits, even soup kitchens and shelters, to verify the immigration status of someone before offering those benefits. So this bill has just passed out of committee, and it's on the third reading calendar in the House, and so we'll see where it goes, but we're definitely keeping an eye on that one.
And to make sure I've got that right, so it's a situation where currently in law, the law simply says as long as you're under a certain income, we assume that you're qualified for these benefits. This would change the law to say now you have to check and make sure that person has legal status before you're providing public services?
That's right. So there are very, very limited public benefits that are available to people who are undocumented. Typically, you do have to apply in a way where you have to, give some kind of information that would indicate one way or another. This bill would just remove something like a soup kitchen or a domestic violence shelter from being able to accept people or offer them food, or vaccines is another important one, like any sort of not emergency medical services, but communicable disease-related services.
Public health matters.
Exactly, thank you. Anything related to public health, they would be forced, these agencies or hospitals even would be forced to check the immigration status of a person before offering those benefits.
My colleague Ruth Brown has coverage of that committee hearing over at idahoreports.org. Another immigration-related bill has to do with education, and this would be directing school districts to collect information on the legal status of their students. Talk to me about that bill.
That's exactly right. So this bill has to do with verifying or really just, as you said, collecting the immigration status of public school students from K through 12 public schools here in Idaho. As it stands, we do collect demographic information on folks who are attending public schools, but it is unusual to collect immigration status. It's, we have Supreme Court decisions that indicate that everybody should have a right to access public education, regardless of, any other, class or type of immigration status. Certainly typically does not affect whether or not you can access schools. And so it seems unusual that we would want to collect the immigration status of children in public schools. The information would also have to be published on the school district's website.
Is that meaning generalized statistics, like how much of the student body is undocumented?
Yeah, so it would be aggregate statistical information, just like you can check to see, in your school district, how many students are below the poverty level or how many students are white. You can, this bill would make it the case that you could also see how many students are undocumented.
as lawmakers are introducing and running these bills through the process, obviously immigration is a big topic nationally, and it's the context that we're living in right now. But as lawmakers are working on these bills, what's their stated motivation for doing this at the state level here?
It's tough to say what their motivation is. We hear a lot about keeping Idaho safe and that immigration is really a matter of public safety. We know in the instance of all of the bills that I've just discussed, it would do very little to make Idaho safer. And instead, I think, we could think about the ways that it might create, a fissure between immigrant communities who might want to report a crime to the police and might be afraid to do so. And also, I think, we think about sort of communities, right? Like some sort of fissure between neighbor to neighbor community sort of sensibility might be eroded with these types of bills. So we're definitely concerned about that.
There are more bills, of course. There are more bills that have to do with kind of that similar public safety arena. But your organization is concerned a number of those would have disproportionate impacts based on gender identity and sexual orientation. Talk to me about some of those. Let's start with the public indecency bill that's been introduced by some lawmakers out of Nampa.
Yeah, this is a bill that, that the lawmakers who introduced the bill referenced a pride event, an LGBTQ pride event that happened in Canyon County, which, by the way, was a really beautiful showing of community.
The first Pride Festival in Canyon County.
That's exactly right. And it was just so well attended and was just a really incredible event, and the sponsors did excellent work there. However, during the event, it appears as though there were some bad faith actors who attended the event not to celebrate LGBTQ pride or the queer community, but instead really to take a look around and see what they might find that they're troubled by. And so this bill would expand the definition of indecent exposure to include the breasts of people who are trans. It's really the first instance that we've heard of where a trans body is being criminalized in this way. So we know indecent exposure is a real problem, but to extend that in a way that is vague, which this bill does, it could create an air of surveillance or distrust where people, ordinary folks are monitoring, again, their neighbors' bodies. And then because the bill affords what's called a private cause of action, it could allow people to sue and then get damages for suspecting that somebody is trans. One of the problems with this bill also is that in Code Now, with indecent exposure, it says, if this happens in public or in a place where somebody might be offended, it could, it counts as a crime. What we're worried about with the new and broader definition to include medically altered chests or breasts that explicitly targets trans folks is that suggesting that to be exposed in a way that is maybe, is certainly not considered indecent now, in a public place or in any place where somebody might be offended, that feels quite broad and it's troublesome.
Lawmakers who are running this legislation have portrayed it as modernizing Idaho's indecent exposure statute. They point to the only mention of breasts in the existing statute is to say that breastfeeding is not indecent exposure, but largely the statute has to deal with genitalia. And so they're wanting to make sure that breasts are also covered, and there's, like you referenced, some pretty specific language in there about hormonally or surgically altered male breasts that appear like female breasts. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty explicitly making sure it also covers transgender people. Mm-hmm. But can you explain to me a little bit more the logic of if a transgender person is walking around fully clothed in the street, how does, walk me through your concern that people will be profiled in those non-questionable settings?
Yeah, I think the example that comes to mind is perhaps a trans man mowing his lawn, and it's summer and it's hot, and he is topless because he's a trans man and has every right to do that. We're concerned that if this happens in the backyard and a bad faith neighbor suggests that he is offended by this person's body, and more importantly, if this happens in the front yard, what does it mean that we are, suppressing the bodily autonomy of trans folks and fundamentally criminalizing a trans body? So that part is deeply troubling.
Another gender-related bill that you wanted to talk about has to do with public facilities. This is gendered spaces like restrooms and locker rooms in public facilities. Talk to me about what this bill would do.
Yeah, so this bill would bar transgender individuals from certain kinds of public spaces, institutional spaces, including correctional facilities, domestic violence centers, shelters, and state educational institutions, so that would include dorm rooms. And it would say that folks should be segregated according to their sex assigned at birth, which is a problem for folks who are trans, who, they present as men or women because they are men or women and they just happen to be trans. And so to force a trans man or a trans woman into a correctional facility, I think one of the things we're troubled by is that this is stylized as a way to keep people safe, but it's clear that forcing a trans man into a correctional facility that's for women would make everyone feel less safe.
And this is continuing a trend here at the State House of the Idaho Legislature, working to define gender and sex as sex assigned at birth over the last several years, over many years, going back to disagreements over amending birth certificates and whatnot. What else is going on this year in this arena?
Yeah, I think, again, we've seen an attempt to ban drag performances. This is clearly, it's an attack on the LGBTQ community. It's an attack on a vital piece of queer culture. And it is also a First Amendment concern, right? It's a censorship issue. We know that drag is a beautiful form of art that should be honored and should not be suppressed or in any way sort of relegated into the realm of indecency. That's not what drag is about, and so it's deeply troubling.
Lawmakers have been increasingly using what are called private causes of action, which we referenced a little bit earlier. So that is allowing a private citizen to pursue a lawsuit in the courts to enforce these laws rather than having an agent of the state like a police officer or a sheriff's deputy enforcing it. Some lawmakers have expressed concern with that increased trend in legislation with private causes of action. What are the ACLU's concerns with that mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about the ways that these bills, first and foremost threaten the rights of all Idahoans to freely express themselves or be able to, exert some sort of bodily autonomy. But then on top of that, we're seeing, as you said, this private cause of action, which means that we can anticipate some pretty substantial burdens on our courts, and our judiciary system is already rather burdened. We're backed up. We have been for some time. And it's not just in the area of LGBTQ rights, right? I think with the drag ban, there's an important connection to be made around moves from the legislature to restrict speech and protest and other forms of dissent that are vital. When we're imposing a private cause of action, one, we're creating an air of sort of surveillance and vigilantism in the worst case, but we're also forcing the courts to hear these types of cases. We know that 1 in 4 people can't afford a private attorney. So when we're thinking about this broad expansion of criminal acts, what counts as a crime, who counts as a criminal, we have to think about the fact that these people are probably going to need, in all likelihood, a public defender. We know that our public defense system is broken, and we know that it is, the speech and protest concerns around drag are the same that we're seeing with increased penalties for rioting, for example, or new mandatory minimums for crimes against cops. We can just think about the ways that all of these bills taken together throughout the 2025 legislative session that we've just spoken about today will have a real material impact on Idaho courts and on our public defense system.
And the ACLU, of course, has been one of the lead voices in the reforms that have been necessary over the last decade plus with the public defense system. What does your organization make of the progress that's been made so far in that arena as we've transitioned from a county-based system to this new centralized state office?
Yeah, we're concerned that, you know, the problems that prompted us to file the Tucker lawsuit, as you said, just over a decade ago, those are still existing. The consolidation of the public defense system into a statewide system from the counties has not made any tangible difference in who has access to who has access to a public defense attorney, and whether or not people are getting their constitutionally guaranteed rights to due process. So we're very troubled by what I would say is perhaps a lack of progress. We know that the governor did set aside $88 million for the new statewide public defense system, but we want to ensure that that money is allocated in a way that is going to resolve some of the egregious civil rights violations that we've seen to folks who are in the public defense system, which again is most people.
All right, well, we will keep an eye on all of these policy topics as they move through both the legislative and judicial arenas. Amy Dundon with the ACLU of Idaho, thanks for your time this week.
Thanks so much, Logan.
Thanks for listening to the Idaho Reports podcast. Tune in to the Friday show at 8 p.m. on Idaho Public Television, and visit idahoreports.org to stream episodes and keep up to date with the events of the 2025 legislative session.
Support for Idaho Public Television comes from the School of Public Service at Boise State University, providing objective and impactful research for Idaho and beyond, and academic programs with hands-on learning that equip students to be effective public service leaders.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.